The finality of her expulsion was not a shout, but the oiled, definitive click of a heavy oak door closing behind her. For 18 years, the state had been her parent, a vast and impersonal entity of timetables and sterile hallways. And with that single, quiet sound, she was orphaned once more. Elara stood on the stone steps of the institution, a place that had never been a home, and watched as the December sky, the color of a bruised plum, promised a cold that was no longer theoretical. The world, which had always been a distant concept viewed through thick, barred windows, was now a terrifyingly immediate expanse, and she, a fledgling pushed from a nest she had never wanted, was utterly, irrevocably alone. The wind, a keen and biting thing, whipped a strand of dark hair across her face, a stinging welcome to her newfound freedom, which felt only like a more profound form of imprisonment. She clutched the thin fabric of her coat, a garment as inadequate as the life skills the institution had imparted, and felt the immensity of the silence that now surrounded her, a silence no longer punctuated by bells or the echoing footsteps of other wards. In her hand was a thin, manila envelope, the entirety of her severance from the life she had known. The matron, a woman whose face was a permanent mask of weary disapproval, had passed it to her with an air of bureaucratic finality, her words clipped and devoid of warmth. Inside, Elara found the sum of $112, a collection of worn bills that felt impossibly flimsy, a laughable shield against the coming winter. Alongside the money lay a brittle, folded document, its creases threatening to tear. It was a deed, the paper yellowed and smelling of dust and forgotten things, granting her ownership of a property in the northern ridges, a place her great-grandmother had once owned. The matron had offered a dry, mirthless chuckle when she mentioned it, a place called Stone's Folly, a name that tasted of mockery and failure. The final item in the envelope was a single, heavy key, its iron body pitted with rust, its teeth filed into a complex, unfamiliar pattern. It felt less like a key to a door and more like a key to a riddle, a cold, unyielding piece of a past she had never known, a legacy that the world had already judged as worthless. This was her inheritance, a pittance, a joke of a property, and a useless piece of metal. The journey north was a descent into a progressively harsher reality. It began on a rumbling bus, the engine a constant, weary groan that vibrated through the cracked vinyl seats. Through the grime-streaked window, the gentle, rolling hills of the south slowly gave way to a landscape that was sharper, bonier, and less forgiving. The greens and browns bled into a stark palette of gray stone and the deep, somber green of pine forests that clung stubbornly to the slopes. The towns they passed through grew smaller and more isolated, their clapboard houses hunkered down against the ever-present wind. The second leg of the journey was a rattling local connector, little more than a van, that smelled of damp wool and diesel fuel. Its passengers were few, their faces weathered and etched with the lines of a hard life, their glances at her fleeting and incurious. Finally, the driver let her off at a crossroads marked only by a leaning wooden sign, its painted letters long since scoured away by wind and snow. From here, he had grunted, pointing a gloved finger up a steep, winding track. It was a long walk. And so she walked, her small, scruffy terrier, Pip, trotting nervously at her heels, the only warm, living thing in a world that was rapidly turning to stone and ice. The track was a scar on the mountainside, and with every upward step, the air grew thinner and colder, a blade against her exposed skin. When she finally saw it, huddled beneath a brooding gray escarpment, her heart, which had been a small, tight knot of anxiety, seemed to collapse into a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The reality of Stone's Folly was far worse than any dismissive name could have conveyed. It was not a house, it was a skeleton. A jagged ruin of collapsed fieldstone walls stood in a rough rectangle, open to the sky. One end was dominated by a listing stone chimney, a great, soot-blackened monolith that seemed to defy gravity, its top clawing at the oppressive clouds. The roof was gone, its timbers having long ago rotted and fallen, now lying in a chaotic jumble amidst the rubble on the floor. To one side of the ruin, almost hidden by a thicket of skeletal hawthorn, were two heavy, weathered planks of wood nailed across a dark opening in the rock face. A mine entrance, boarded up and forgotten. The wind, up here, was not just wind. It was a physical presence, a predator that circled the ruin, howling as it tore at the loose stones, its voice a symphony of desolation. It was a place where things came to die, and the deed in her pocket felt like a death sentence. For 3 days, despair was a physical paralysis. Elara and Pip huddled in the only part of the ruin that offered any shelter, a corner where 2 sections of wall still met, partially protected by the looming mass of the chimney. She managed to build a small, pathetic fire in the great, yawning hearth, but the flames seemed to be swallowed by the sheer volume of cold stone, offering little more than a flickering, hypnotic light and a plume of smoke that was immediately snatched away by the wind. The heat it produced was a fleeting ghost on her skin. Her meager supply of food, a loaf of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, some dried apples, was dwindling at an alarming rate. Each bite was a countdown. The silence between the wind's shrieks was profound, broken only by the chattering of her own teeth and Pip's occasional, worried whimper as he pressed his small, warm body against her. In that crushing emptiness, the thought of surrender became a seductive whisper. It would be so easy to simply lie down, to let the cold seep into her bones, to close her eyes and let the world fade away. It would be a quiet, painless end to a life that had been a litany of struggle. The cold promised an end to striving, an end to hope, and in her exhaustion, that promise felt like a form of peace. The turning point arrived not with a thunderclap of revelation, but with a small, wet nudge against her cold hand. On the 4th morning, as the gray light of dawn did little to dispel the profound chill, Elara stared into the dying embers of her fire, the seductive languor of surrender pulling at her limbs. She had not eaten since the previous day, saving the last crust of bread for Pip. He whined softly, not for food, but for her. He crept closer and laid his head on her knee, his brown eyes fixed on her face with an expression of such absolute, unwavering trust that it pierced the thick fog of her despair. In his gaze, there was no judgment, no pity, only a simple, profound belief that she would fix this, that she would protect him. That simple, animal faith was a responsibility she could not abdicate. A different feeling began to stir in the pit of her stomach, something that started as a slow, deep burn and quickly rose into a hot, clean, clarifying rage. It was an anger not at the matron or the state or the injustice of her birth, but at the sheer, passive indifference of the universe, at the cold stone and the predatory wind that presumed to claim her. She would not be a passive victim. She would not let this small, trusting creature die because she had given up. She would fight. Her first act of agency was a rebellion against the chaos that surrounded her. She would impose order, even if it was a tiny, meaningless pocket of order in a vast wilderness of entropy. She began to clear the debris from the floor of the ruin. The work was mindless, brutal, and punishing. She heaved fallen timbers, their wood waterlogged and impossibly heavy, prying them from the jumble and stacking them against an outer wall. She lifted stones, her gloveless hands quickly becoming scraped and raw, her fingers numb with cold. She moved with a frenetic energy, fueled by the newfound fire of her anger. Each stone she moved, each splintered beam she dragged aside, was a blow against her own helplessness. The physical pain was a welcome distraction, a sharp, grounding reality that drowned out the insidious whispers of despair. Her back ached, her muscles screamed in protest, but her mind grew quiet, focused only on the immediate task, this stone, then the next. For hours she worked, a solitary figure wrestling with the bones of the dead house, her breath pluming in the frigid air, until a small patch of the original flagstone floor was clear. It was not much, but it was a space she had claimed. It was a start. The shovel, a rusted relic she had found leaning against the chimney, struck something that was not stone. It made a dull, metallic thud, a sound that cut through the rhythmic scrape and crunch of her labor. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she knelt and scraped away the dirt and rubble. The corner of a dark, metal-strapped object emerged. With renewed vigor, she dug around it, her heart beginning to beat with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm of anticipation. Slowly, she unearthed a heavy, iron-bound trunk, its wooden planks swollen and dark with age, but remarkably intact. It was locked, a heavy, ornate plate of rusted iron guarding its secrets. And then she remembered. The key. With trembling, dirt-caked fingers, she retrieved the heavy iron key from her pocket. It felt different now, no longer a useless curiosity, but a potential solution. She pushed it into the lock. It resisted, grumbled with the rust of ages, but with a final, forceful turn, there was a loud, grating click. The lock had opened. She lifted the heavy lid, a scent of dry leather, old paper, and something faintly herbal, like dried lavender, rising to meet her. Inside, nestled in the dark, was not gold or silver, but something far more precious. On top lay a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with a single, elegant initial, L. Beneath it, a series of tightly rolled schematics, tied with faded ribbon. Elara unrolled the first one on the cleared flagstones. It was a complex and beautiful diagram, drawn with a precise, architectural hand, showing a cutaway of the ruin she was in, the looming chimney, and the adjacent mine shaft. But in the drawing, they were not separate entities. They were interconnected parts of a single, ingenious system. She opened the journal. The handwriting was a fluid, confident script, the ink faded but still perfectly legible. It was the journal of her great-grandmother, Elara, dated nearly a century prior. The early pages spoke of her arrival, her vision for a home that worked in harmony with the mountain, not against it, and the condescending dismissal of her neighbors who had dubbed her project Stone's Folly. Elara, it turned out, was not an eccentric. She was a physicist and an engineer, a woman born far ahead of her time. The journal and the schematics were the complete blueprint for what she called the Ethelberg system, a revolutionary design for survival that combined a high-mass masonry stove with a passive geothermal heat exchange loop running deep into the stable, 50-degree air of the abandoned mine. It was a system designed not to constantly fight the cold by burning fuel, but to capture, store, and radiate a vast amount of thermal energy, turning the entire structure into a gentle, self-regulating furnace. The discovery changed everything. The faded ink and precise lines of the schematics were a map, not just to survival, but to a different way of thinking. Elara's vision was audacious and elegant. The plan was no longer to patch up a ruin against the coming winter. It was to fully realize her great-grandmother's brilliant, misunderstood design. She would not be rebuilding a conventional house. She would be constructing a fortress, a semi-subterranean shelter integrated directly into the landscape. The plan detailed in the journal involved using the collapsed stone walls to build a smaller, thicker, more insulated structure within the ruin's footprint. The centerpiece would be the massive masonry stove built directly into the existing chimney stack. This stove, a labyrinth of internal channels, was designed to absorb the heat from a single, hot, fast-burning fire and then radiate that heat slowly for 24 hours or more. The most ingenious part, however, was the integration with the mine. A system of terracotta flues would draw cold air from the shelter, pull it deep into the mine shaft where the Earth's constant temperature would warm it, and then feed that pre-warmed air back into the base of the stove for combustion, creating a hyper-efficient, self-sustaining loop. It was a plan that flew in the face of all conventional wisdom, which dictated bigger fires and leakier houses. It was a plan of quiet elegance, not brute force. And as she looked from the schematics to the ruin around her, she saw not a pile of rubble, but a collection of raw materials, waiting for her. Her purpose, once a dim and flickering ember, was now a clear, bright flame. The descent into the town of Blackwood was a stark contrast to her arrival. Weeks of grueling labor had transformed her. She was thinner, her face gaunt and smudged with soot and stone dust, but her eyes, which had been dull with despair, now held a focused, unnerving intensity. Her movements were no longer hesitant. They were economical and deliberate, honed by the repetitive motion of lifting and placing stone. As she and Pip walked down the main street, a muddy track carved between rows of gray-faced buildings, people stopped and stared. They saw a wild-looking creature, a wraith from the mountain, her clothes torn and her hands wrapped in crude bandages made from strips of her own shirt. She ignored their whispers and their pointed fingers, her gaze fixed on the sign for the town's largest supplier. Croft and Sons Mercantile, she had a list, transcribed carefully from Lyra's journal, and she would not be deterred. Silas Croft, the proprietor of the Mercantile and a prominent town councilman, was a large man whose physical bulk was matched only by the size of his self-regard. He looked down his nose at her as she stood before his counter, a small, grimy figure clutching a piece of paper. He took the list from her hand, his lip curling in a sneer as he read it. Fire bricks, refractory mortar, 100 feet of 6-inch terracotta pipe, damper controls, cast iron fittings. He let out a loud, braying laugh that drew the attention of the other patrons in the store. "You must be the girl who took on Stone's folly," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. He informed her, and the store at large, that she was a fool. That pile of rocks had killed better men than her. He jabbed a thick finger at her list. "This is nonsense, girl. You want to survive the winter up there? You need a good cast-iron potbelly stove, a cord of seasoned oak, and a miracle. Not this plumbing for a furnace that'll never work." He publicly predicted her failure, telling her she'd be a frozen cautionary tale by mid-January. His words, intended to humiliate and crush her, had the opposite effect. Each syllable of his mockery was like a hammer blow on hot steel, tempering her resolve into something harder and more unbreakable than ever before. She simply stared back at him, her silence a more potent response than any argument, and asked him for the total. The cost, as she had feared, was more than double the $80 she had left. Croft's smug grin widened as she stood, silent and defeated, unable to pay. She turned without a word and walked out of the store, the laughter of the other men following her into the street. Her heart was a cold lump of dread, but she refused to let the despair return. There was one other place, a smaller, quieter general store at the far end of town, run by an elderly man named Alistair Finch. He was a stooped figure with kind eyes and a face as wrinkled as a dried apple, and he watched her approach from behind his cluttered counter. He listened patiently as she explained what she needed, his gaze drifting from her determined face to her raw, bandaged hands. He had heard of her, of course. The whole town had. He looked at her list, his brow furrowed in thought, recognizing the components for a cachalophin, a masonry heater of the old country. A fool's gamble, he murmured, more to himself than to her. He told her his own grandfather had tried to build something similar and failed. But then he looked at her again, and he saw something that Silas Croft, in his arrogance, had missed. He saw not a foolish girl, but a fighter. He saw grit. "I'll make you a wager," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I'll extend you the credit for these materials. Not as charity, mind you, but as a bet on that look in your eyes. You pay me back in the spring if you're still here to do it." That quiet act of faith, that grudging validation from a skeptical stranger, was a greater gift than all the money in Croft's register. It was the first time anyone had bet on her to win. In the weeks that followed, a new urgency settled over the mountain. News arrived with a traveling fur trapper, spreading through the valley like a contagion of fear. A wolf winter was coming. The old-timers, reading the signs in the behavior of the animals and the deep, persistent chill in the air, agreed. The almanacs predicted it. A storm of the century, a blizzard of historic proportions, was brewing in the Arctic and bearing down on them. The town of Blackwood was thrown into a frenzy of preparation. The activity was loud, panicked, and centered on the conventional wisdom championed by Silas Croft. His mercantile did a booming business, selling every potbelly stove, every propane heater, every axe and chainsaw they had in stock. The air filled with the constant whine of saws as men frantically cut and split wood, creating massive, teetering stacks of firewood beside their homes. The guiding principle was accumulation, a brute force assault against the coming cold. Croft himself was the loudest voice, striding through town dispensing advice, boasting of his own 2 cords of oak and his backup propane generator. He was the picture of confident, arrogant preparation. Elara's preparations were a study in contrast. While the valley below echoed with the sounds of panic, her corner of the mountain was filled only with the quiet, methodical sounds of her labor. The chink of her trowel as she laid the fire bricks, the soft scrape of stone on stone, the whisper of the wind through the pines. Following Lyra's diagrams with painstaking care, she constructed the heart of the system, the massive masonry stove. It rose from the floor, a solid, monolithic structure of stone and brick, its interior a complex maze of channels designed to make the hot gases of the fire travel a long, slow path, surrendering their heat to the thermal mass before exiting through the chimney. She relayed the stone walls of her new, smaller shelter, packing the gaps with a mixture of mud and moss as her great-grandmother's journal instructed. She unboarded the mine entrance and, fighting a primal fear of the deep, echoing darkness, installed the terracotta pipes that would form the geothermal loop. Her woodpile, when she was finished, was shockingly small, barely a quarter of a cord of the driest pine and birch she could find. It was a source of great amusement to a hunter who passed by her ruin, shaking his head at her folly. Her final act of preparation was not one of frantic accumulation, but of quiet ritual. On the day before the sky turned a leaden, ominous gray, she loaded the firebox of the great stove, and with a prayer to Elara, she lit a single, roaring fire. For 5 hours, she fed the flames, getting the fire as intensely hot as she could. The stone and brick drank in the heat, becoming too hot to touch. Then, following the final instructions, she sealed the firebox, closed the main chimney damper, and opened the small vent to the geothermal loop. The system was now charged. All that was left to do was wait. The storm arrived as a silent, white phantom, the first flakes drifting down with an eerie lack of wind. Then, the sky opened. The world beyond her small, thick window dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The wind, which had been a constant companion, rose to a terrifying, shrieking crescendo, a physical force that seemed intent on tearing the mountain from its roots. In the town of Blackwood, the fight began. The potbelly stoves, so prized by Croft, were ravenous beasts. They devoured firewood at an astonishing rate, roaring to life and making the areas immediately around them unbearably hot, while the corners of the rooms remained freezing. The constant need to be fed meant a constant traffic of freezing air as doors were opened to fetch more wood. Within 2 days, the carefully hoarded fuel supplies began to dwindle at an alarming pace. The technology they had relied upon began to fail. Propane heaters sputtered and died as their tanks froze. Croft's vaunted generator, its fuel lines gelled by the unprecedented cold, refused to start. The houses, built to breathe, became iceboxes, the wind finding every crack and crevice, leaching away any warmth that was produced. The mood shifted from confident defiance to grim fear, and then to outright panic as the storm raged on, day after day, with no sign of abating. It was a desperate, losing battle against an enemy that never tired. At Stone's Folly, there was only silence. The thick stone walls, banked with earth and snow, muffled the storm's fury to a distant, hollow moan. Inside the small, womb-like shelter, a profound and gentle warmth radiated from the monolithic stove. The surface of the masonry was not hot to the touch, but a steady, constant source of radiant heat that warmed every object in the room. The air was still and calm, the temperature a stable and comfortable 68 degrees. There were no drafts, no cold spots. The Ethelberg system worked flawlessly. The faint, almost imperceptible current of air being drawn into the geothermal vent was the only sign of the complex engine at work, silently pulling the Earth's own warmth into the heart of her home. Elara and Pip lived in a bubble of impossible peace. She spent her days reading Lyra's journal, learning not just the science of thermodynamics, but the philosophy of a woman who saw the world as a system of elegant, interconnected flows. She ate from the stores of dried goods she had purchased with Alastair Finch's credit, her meals slow and deliberate. Pip slept soundly, curled on a rag rug in the gentle warmth, no longer shivering, no longer afraid. While the world outside was a maelstrom of frigid, chaotic violence, her small shelter was an island of profound security and abundance. She had not conquered the winter, she had made peace with it. After 7 days, the wind finally died. A brilliant, painful sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a world transformed. Elara pushed open the heavy, insulated door of her shelter and stepped out into a landscape of profound and lethal beauty. The snow was piled in immense drifts, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes, burying everything in a blanket of pristine white 10 feet deep. The air was so cold it felt crystalline, each breath a sharp intake of icy needles. But from a single, narrow pipe extending from the roof of her buried shelter, a faint, shimmering heat haze rose into the frigid air, and the snow on the capstones of her chimney was completely melted. Her small home was a living, breathing thing in the midst of a frozen world. Miles below, the town of Blackwood emerged slowly, like survivors from a shipwreck. The storm was over, but its devastation was complete. Houses were damaged, livestock frozen in the fields. The great woodpiles were gone, and a deep, penetrating cold had settled into the very bones of the community, a cold that would linger for weeks. They were exhausted, depleted, and defeated. It took 2 more days for a party from the town to make the arduous trek up the mountain. They came on snowshoes, a grim procession led by Silas Croft and Alastair Finch, their mission a somber one: to recover the body of the foolish girl from the ridges. They expected to find the ruin buried, a frozen tomb. As they drew closer, however, they saw something that made them stop in confusion. A single, narrow path of melted snow, no wider than a foot, led from the buried structure to the boarded-up mine entrance. And from a vent pipe sticking out of a massive snowdrift, a visible plume of warm air was rising. Finch pointed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "That's impossible." Croft merely scowled, convinced it was a trick of the light, a geothermal vent from the mine itself, perhaps. They reached the spot where the ruin should be and found only a deep, sloping drift, with the top of the great stone chimney jutting out like a monument. At the base of the drift was the dark rectangle of a door, its frame clear of snow. They approached cautiously, a sense of deep unease settling over them. Croft, reasserting his authority, banged a heavy fist on the wood. There was a pause, the sound of a bar being lifted from inside, and the door swung open. The men recoiled as if struck. A solid wall of dry, comfortable warmth washed over them, a stark and shocking contrast to the biting cold. It was the heat of a summer afternoon, a scent of warm stone, bread, and something else, something clean and alive. And in the doorway stood Elara, dressed in a simple shirt, her face calm, her hair clean. Behind her, the little dog trotted forward, wagging its tail. The men stared, dumbfounded, into the small, warm, well-lit space. They saw the great masonry stove, its surface gently radiating heat. They saw shelves laden with food. They saw a person who was not merely surviving, but thriving. Silas Croft, his face a mask of disbelief, his own home still a frigid box despite his best efforts, finally found his voice. It was a choked, incredulous stammer. How? The single word hung in the cold air, a confession of his own complete and utter failure. Elara looked at the man who had mocked her, not with triumph, but with a quiet, simple pity. "I didn't fight the cold," she replied, her voice steady. "I invited it to work for me." She explained the principle, the elegant simplicity of Lyra's design, storing a massive amount of heat in the stone, then letting it radiate slowly, using the constant temperature of the earth itself to warm the air needed for the fire. It wasn't about the size of the fire, but the intelligence of its application. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of his own catastrophic ignorance, Croft's authority, built on a foundation of loud, brute force arrogance, evaporated into the cold mountain air. The other men looked from him to her, and the narrative of the entire valley shifted on its axis. He turned, without another word, and began the long, humiliating walk back to town. The story of the girl who had tamed the wolf winter spread faster than the coldest wind. She was no longer the outcast, the folly girl. She became a figure of awe, a local legend. Within a week, the first pilgrims began to arrive. They came not to gawk, but to learn. It was Alastair Finch who led them, his face a mixture of pride and wonder. He brought with him a payment for his wager, a side of bacon, a sack of flour, and the town's collective, unspoken apology. One by one, then in small groups, the people of Blackwood made the trek up the mountain. They brought gifts of food, tools, and respect. They stood in her small, warm home and listened as she, with the aid of her great-grandmother's journal and schematics, explained the principles of thermal mass, of passive geothermal exchange, of working with the natural flows of energy instead of against them. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a custodian of a forgotten wisdom. She taught them how to build their own smaller, more efficient masonry stoves, how to better insulate their homes using earth and moss, how to see their environment not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a partner in survival. She shared the knowledge freely, holding nothing back, and in doing so, she began to transform not just their homes, but their entire way of life. Years passed. The gaunt, fierce girl from the institution slowly transformed into the woman she was always meant to be. The lines of hardship on her face were softened by a quiet confidence, her eyes holding the deep, calm wisdom of the mountain itself. Stone's Folly was no longer a ruin, but a home, expanded and improved upon over the years, a living testament to Lyra's genius and Elara's tenacity. The town of Blackwood changed with her. The harsh winters still came, but they were no longer a season of fear and depletion. The skyline was now dotted with the low, solid profiles of masonry chimneys, their gentle heat plumes a sign of quiet efficiency. The houses were warmer, the people healthier, their lives no longer a constant, desperate battle for warmth. Elara became their teacher, their matriarch, a living legend known simply as the Woman of the Mountain. Young people, born long after the Wolf Winter, would make the pilgrimage to her home to learn the old ways, which were now the new ways. They learned to read the landscape, to understand the physics of heat and cold, and to respect the elegant power of a well-thought-out design. The final, triumphant irony was that the arrogant, brute force solutions championed by men like Silas Croft were proven not just to be wrong, but to be profoundly weak. True strength, the town had learned, was not found in the loudest voice or the biggest fire. It was found in quiet observation, in patient labor, and in the humility to listen to the wisdom of the past. It was found in the rediscovery of value in a place everyone had discarded, and in the resilience of a single person who refused to be broken.